All right. All right. Well, welcome, guys. Thanks for taking the time to join us this morning. I hope this will be profitable for you as we continue to go through an example from John's Gospel and just looking at how to study narratives. I was reading one of my classes that I'm taking. I'm a student as well, taking some classes. One author focusing attention on it's a book about interpretation, hermeneutics, and he was making a good point about looking at different genres in the Bible. Of course, as we focus on now on narratives, we just did epistles in the first module, and we'll do poetry, then prophecy in the future modules. And he was talking about just how each genre they have their own rules, kind of like a game. When you sit down and play a game, our family likes to play games, but each game has its own set of rules. And there are many games of a certain type that may have some similar features like dice or a board or cards. Um, but each game has its own set of rules. And so when you sit down to play a game, you learn the rules to that game. And when everyone knows the rules, then we can all play the game together. But if you were playing with different sets of rules, it wouldn't work, right? If you're one person's trying to play, Monopoly, and another person is using at the same game, they're playing poker, it's not going to work. Um, Neither one will understand what the other one is doing, and the game won't be able to play. And so he was drawing a comparison as like an illustration for genres, that when we approach different genres, there are different rules for how you understand the genre. There are some that are common, like for example, we'll have language and grammar and word meaning and things like that. But there are specific things, um, particular things for each genre. So, for example, in narratives, there's some similar features where we're reading the same language. There's going to be rules of grammar that govern um, those things. But also in narratives, things are put together, and the way the author uses a narrative is different than how he would use an epistle or a poem. And so, as he's writing the story, he's going by a certain set of rules that come with uh, narratives. And then we, as the reader, the audience of those stories, also need to understand and go by the same rules. And so that's why for us, the rules, those are the hermeneutics. Those are the rules of interpretation. And so we have some of the common rules, like authorial intent. That's a common hermeneutic for all biblical books, really all forms of communication. We have inerrancy, right? That's a common hermeneutic, a rule of interpretation that we apply in every passage in the Bible. And as I said a moment ago, there'll be rules of grammar because each of these books were written in a particular language that had grammatical rules. And so we'll follow those rules to understand. But so there's commonality in those. But then when we approach a narrative, we're actually going to be looking for features that are only really found in narrative writings. All right. And so those are kind of like the rules of the game. And in order to understand the narrative, we have to use the same rules that the author used. And so that's why we've been going through these examples, and why I wanted to do another one with you from the Gospel of John, is just to reinforce some of those some rules that are unique to studying stories. And we spent, some time looking through those foundational rules, interpretive rules, and looking at stories have a plot and setting and scenes, and that these reveal the point of the story. and that we look at a story, we don't break down every single thing that was written and try to attach some doctrinal proposition or command to everything written, because sometimes it's just the main point that we need to find the doctrinal truth to respond to. Other things in the story are maybe there just because that's what happened. We talked about the principle of descriptive versus prescriptive. So we said that descriptive is just a word that means it's describing something, it's telling what happened. And that's what stories do. They just tell us what happened, events that actually took place. But in those events, not everything that the author tells us about in the story is meant for us to respond to it. So when we read, a story about, Gideon and the fleece, and he puts that, I think it was a sheepskin, right? He puts out on the ground and says, Lord, if you're going to deliver us, give us victory, then let there be dew, water on the fleece tonight and tomorrow. That was just something he did. That doesn't mean, oh, okay, if I want assurance that God's going to answer my prayer, I need to find a sheep and take off its wool and put it on the ground and then pray and tell God that, make it wet tomorrow, and then I'll know this is going to happen. This wasn't a prescription, right? Prescription means to prescribe something, that it's something we're supposed to do in response. But narratives aren't written like that, where everything in the story is prescriptive. No, everything in the story is descriptive. It's describing these events that are meant to show us the point to the story. And the point of the story, that's where the prescription is. Now, when it comes to scripture, the moral of the story, the main idea of the story, the point of the story is a theological point that we are meant to respond to. So, like, for example, in Gideon's story, we have to identify, okay, what is the author's point here in telling us this story? And really, it's an example of a lack of faith. Sometimes we use that story to say, wow, how great Gideon was. And actually, it's because he struggled with faith. So he put out these tests, and God was very patient and responded to them. But we need to dig deeper and study more carefully to find the author's point of the story. And then from that point, that's where we draw the theological, doctrinal, timeless truth that we're called to respond to. And so we've been looking at John's gospel. We started last week, and we identified John actually gave us his purpose, the purpose of his gospel explicitly, right? If you'll remember, it's in John chapter 20. Right, verse 30, we have it here. In fact, I'm going to ask Brother Sonny if he could read for us verses 30 and 31 here from John chapter 20.
Right.
Thank you.
Therefore, many other signs Jesus also did in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name.
All right. So here we see the purpose statement of John, as we talked about last week, and as I'm sure you're familiar with, right? These have been written. What are these? The signs Jesus did. And the signs that he did write about were written with a specific purpose, right? So that you may believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you may have life in his name. And so that's the purpose statement. So we know that really and John does this very consistently. There's a prescription from every story, and that prescription is that we would believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and have life in his name as a result. And so the focus of this gospel is really on the nature of belief, and then he offers the nature of unbelief as well. And so each story reveals something that shows us that Christ is the Messiah, the Son of God, and then as well the importance of putting our trust in him. And so as we look at each story, the plot of those stories is in some way going to be connected. The point of those stories will in some way be connected to John's purpose in this gospel. And so our objective when we do narrative analysis is to find the point of each story, understand how that story connected to the one before it, the one after it, and how it connects to the purpose of the book. And if you're able to answer those three questions, how does this story, or well, four really, what's the point of this story? The first question. The second is, how does this story relate to the story or stories that came before it? Third question, how does this story relate to the stories that come after it, especially the one right after it? And then the fourth question, how does this story relate to the purpose of the book? If you can answer those questions, then you're ready to teach the passage. All right. But we have to be able to answer those questions. We have to know, okay, how does this fit? That's what the whole point of the author's intent tells us. The author had a reason to tell us about this story. He had a reason why he put the story where he did in his book. And he had a reason to write all of those stories in their sequence. There's an overall purpose for the book. And John and Luke, they tell us the purpose of their story explicitly. Most biblical narrative books don't, but they all do have a purpose. They all do have a flow. They all have a point. They're all putting stories in a sequence in order to connect to the overall purpose of the book. And so the more you're able to remember that and think that way as you approach studying each of these stories, that the more likely it is you will find the author's main point of the story. If we don't do that, if we don't understand the purpose of the book, if we don't understand how the story fits in the book, how it connects to the stories around it, how it connects to the purpose, if we don't understand those things, then probably what will happen is we import our own ideas into the story as to what it means. So we don't want to do that. Obviously, we want to understand what's God saying, through the human author. What is the divine and human author telling us in this particular story that we can then apply to our lives? And that's what makes biblical narratives difficult. Frankly, they're more difficult than epistles. Epistles have difficult doctrine at times to understand, but at least it's laid out in a logical flow. Everything is prescriptive, right? It's direct. And we've done diagramming, things like that, in order to show us that those connections and how the sentences, the words and phrases connect together in the paragraph. But narratives are a little different, not like that. In a narrative, we have to look at narrative features, such as the setting, the characters, scenes, and the plot. Okay, and so I know this is review, but I'm just trying to reinforce the core principle here and really the focus of this second module, which looks at narratives, in order to equip us to be most effective in understanding the story, how to study it, and then how to communicate the point of that story to our hearers. And even for us, just reading through biblical stories, that we would have the right lenses that we're reading these stories through, and look at them in the correct way. Okay, so with all that as sort of the introduction this morning, let's turn our attention back to John chapter 4, the example of the woman at the well. Last week we covered sort of the first three steps here in sort of just a short fashion, and you will find that last session to be helpful for you in doing those assignments, the first three assignments for your passage from the Gospel of John. Uh, on read and observe the book, discover the background context, discover the contextual flow. Those are the first three assignments. So I gave you a lot of helpful information to get you moving on those assignments. And you can refer to that when you work on them. You can refer to the last session for that. Now I want to turn our attention to the passage level. Now we're going to really, I should put the story level here of the passage we're looking at. And this is, as I said, in John 4. And the first step, we're going to do narrative analysis. And if you'll remember, the four steps to narrative analysis that I list here, just to remind ourselves, is we want to look at the setting, scenes, then the character, then the plot. All right, these are the four primary characteristics or features in narratives. And so we want to give particular attention to each one of those. And so my goal this morning for us is to look at the setting, do the setting analysis for John chapter 4. And if you'll remember, the setting is concerned with, it's focused on really the when, the where, and the who of the story. All right, when did this story take place? What time period? And not just generally, well, this story took place in 27 BC. Well, we won't, I don't mean to have that specificity necessarily, but like, for example, if we're in the Gospel of John, we know the story's covered during Jesus's ministry. So we have an idea it's during the ministry of Jesus on earth, either in the beginning, the middle, toward the end of his ministry. So it's a general idea of when do the events of the story take place. And so the setting focuses on the when of the story, and then sometimes what particular day or time of day might be included in that, the setting, the time. Also with the setting, we're interested in the place where the events of this story take place. Do we know the country? Do we know the city? Do we know, is it in somebody's house? And then even some of the other physical features that are mentioned in the story. If it's located in a house, are there anything mentioned about that house? Who's in the house? What's in the house? So that's the where of the setting. And then the who of the setting is, okay, what people are involved? What do we know about those people in general? Right. So those of you studying Jonah, if you are in chapter 1, you not only have Jonah to consider, you also have the sailors. These sailors, what do we know about them, just generally speaking? We have the Ninevites in chapter 3. What do we know about Nineveh? The people involved, right? So you'd want to identify that. These are pagan worshiping nation. They're a wicked nation, as Jonah mentions. They ruthless in how they treat other nations. So there's certain features in the setting, just knowing something about, and for Ruth, for example, it's in the days of the judges. Well, what do we know about the people in that time period? There was a lot of sin that happened, right? There was no king, right? So there was no authority really governing over the people. So everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So it's helpful to note that when you're looking at the setting, that Ruth, Naomi, they were in this culture it's very dangerous, especially for women. So that would be the kind of things you would include for that. In fact, kind of getting ahead of myself here and giving you these details, because I was going to mention those here, the specifics, right? So this is the procedure for identifying the setting of the story. First, we want to read through the story several times and make observations. All right, here's where we focus our attention on the story, get more familiar with the story by reading through it several times. All right. And then make observations. These are things you observe personally, you're not getting this from commentary or other resources. These are just things that you notice in the story, things that seem interesting, things that don't make sense. You have questions, maybe connections you see within the story or from the story to other ones. So just anything that comes to your mind. You're just getting familiar with the story. And then secondly, we note all the physical aspects of the story, as I was just talking about, the where of the story, including the location, the other physical features within the story, things that are present. And then note the temporal, that is those elements of the story that have to do with time. When does the story happen? And I already described that. And finally, the cultural aspects of the story, that is who is in the story. As I mentioned a moment ago, we have what were the people like in the days of the judges, the people that are involved in the story of Ruth. What were the Ninevites like, Jonah, those things. So what do we know about that culture? That's part of the setting. That's a background information that's helpful to us. And then sometimes just identifying other aspects of the story, just things that may not fit in these first three categories, but this is where perhaps you might note where the story is given within the flow of the narrative book, and just other things that may come to your mind as part of the background of the particular story. All right. So all of that we want to remember and consider as we are going through um, the setting, doing the setting analysis. Okay? So we're going to go through John 4 together. Before we do that, just want to pause, give opportunity for any question or comment up to this point. This is basically just reviewing. We've just been reviewing for the last few minutes. Any questions or comments? Okay, well, I'm going to ask for you guys to take part in as we read through. Let's read through the story and make some observations as we go through. So as someone is reading, I'm going to break it up into paragraphs. But as each paragraph is read, just look for things, note anything that sticks out to you. Maybe write a note or something. Verse 3, this is something I observed. So I'd like each of us to make an observation or two at the end. So just keep that in mind as we're reading. Let's make this an active reading. So I'm going to ask if Nigel, if you could start and read verses 1 to 6. And then Nell, if you could read verses 7 to 11. Jason, verses 12 to 16. Sunny, 17 to 22. Lyndon, verses 23 to 26. And Bien, verses 27 to 32. Yancey, I'll give you 33 to 38. All right. So hopefully you remember those. And then Lito, I don't remember if I gave you verses. If I didn't, you'll take 39 to 42. Okay, so let me pull up the text and we'll have Nigel start us off here, verses 1 through 6.
All right. John chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, he left Judea and went away again into Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour.
Nell, if you're there, you have verses 7 to 11.
Verse 7. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealing with Samaritans." Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew that the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." She said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then you get the living water?"
Verse 12. You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle? Jesus answered and said to her, everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. The woman said to him, Sir, give me this water, so I will not be thirsty, nor come all the way here to draw. He said to her, Go, call your husband, and come here.
All right. Don't remember. Was Sunny, were you the next one, or was it you, Lyndon?
Yes, sir. That's it. 17.
Oh,
17 to 26. Okay.
thank you.
So the woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, You have correctly said, I have no husband. For you have had five husbands, and the one whom you now have is your husband. This, this you have said truly. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worship in this mountain, and you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for for salvation is from the Jews.
Okay, Lyndon, how about 23 to 26?
But an hour is coming, now is, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for such people the Father sees his worshippers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will bear all things to us. He said to her, I will speak to you.
All right. I think Yancey, were you next?
I am for 33 to 38.
Oh,
That's
okay.
mine, Pastor.
Sorry.
That's mine.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
Verse
Yeah.
27. And at this point, his disciples came and they were marveling that he was speaking with the woman. Yet no one said, What do you seek? Or why are you speaking with her? So the woman left her water jar and went into the city and said to the men, Come see a man who told me all the things that I have done. Is this not the Christ? They went out of the city and were coming to him. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about.
Verse 33. So the disciples were saying to one another, No one brought him anything to eat, did he? Jesus said to them,
My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do you not say, there are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, that they are white for harvest. Already he who reaps is receiving wages and is gathering fruit for life eternal, so that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this case, the saying is true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor.
All right, thank you. And then I think Lito, I asked you to do the last few verses.
From the city, many of the Samaritans believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified. He told me all the things that I have done. So when Samaritans came to Jesus, they were asking him to stay with him. He stayed there 2 days. Many more believed because of his word, and they were saying to the woman, it is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves and know that this one is indeed the Savior of the world.
All right, very good. Thank you, guys. Okay, so let's just go back and we'll just look at a paragraph at a time here, and just make any observations that we have. So I'll ask the person who read the paragraph, I'll ask you to give one or two observations from that paragraph. So I think Nigel, I think this was yours. Just anything that sticks out to you. It can be significant or not. It's just things that you notice. So Nigel, you see anything in those first 6 verses that get your attention, or maybe it's a question, something that you have a question about?
Okay. Baptism is mentioned again.
Sorry, what's mentioned? I didn't.
Baptism.
Oh, baptism. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And then why is it that when Jesus learned that the Pharisees heard this news, he decided to leave Judea and go to another place?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And then, of course, the story reveals it. But at this point, we ask, why did Jesus have to pass through Samaria?
Yes. Yeah, it says, yeah, verse 4, right? He had to pass through. Why is that? Yeah, that's a great question too. Something that stuck out to me was, sorry, did you have another one?
The mention of Jacob's well.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that seems let me see if I can.
Pastor
seems
Tim, since I'm already speaking, I might as well say it. I'll have to excuse myself. I'm sorry, I have to attend to something. I'll just watch a recording.
Okay, no problem. Thanks for your input.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a blessed time, brothers.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So, yeah, as Nigel mentioned here, that Jacob's well specifically, oh, that's verse 6. But even notice the author, John, was very specific about his location, right? That was a thing that stuck out to me. John was specific about the location, right? It's in Samaria. It's near Sukkar. It's the ground that Jacob gave Joseph, and Jacob's well is there. So he's like pinpointing, very specific place. Okay, about verses 7 to 11. I think that was Nell read these. So Nell, if you've got a couple observations from
Yeah, in verse 7, Jesus said to Samaritan woman, give me a drink. Jesus took the initiative speaking to the Samaritan woman.
Okay. Jesus took the initiative to speak to the woman. All right. Anything else stick out to you?
And
And give
also
me
the
a verse.
response of Samaritan woman.
Give me a verse number 2 when you identify something. Sorry, what were you
Verse
saying?
9. The,
Verse 9.
yeah, the
Okay.
verse 9, Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink since I'm a Samaritan woman?"
So she points out the Jew Samaritan, I guess call it conflict or tension. I don't know, something like that. Problem. How about we just call it that? Good. Any others? Or even
Yeah, in verse 11,
okay.
you have nothing to draw with and the well is deep. Where did you get the living water? The Samaritan woman asked Jesus.
So what sticks out to you about that, or what is
Mm. Oh yeah, I mean, has,
I mean, for me, I might have a question of what is the living water he's talking about here? That's something that came to my mind. So, okay, good. Anybody else have one from this part? Or Nell, if you have another one, that's great. Or if anyone else has one before we go to the next paragraph. Anybody? Okay, let's go to the next one then. Thanks, Nell. Who read this one? Was that you, Jason?
Yes, Dr.
17, sir, to 22. That's mine.
Oh,
So,
sorry. Who read this one? Verses 12 to 16. I don't remember.
it's me.
Oh, Jason. Yeah, right. Okay.
Observation.
Yeah, just a couple things maybe you notice here stick out to you, or maybe puzzling, or
Yeah, the woman is speaking about the well again.
yeah, verse 12, right? The woman continues to talk about the well. Right? She obviously didn't she didn't understand Jesus's spiritual reference, right? When he talks about living water, she's still thinking about the physical water there, it seems. Anything else struck you here?
Verse 13.
What about it?
Jesus offers the woman the living water.
Yeah, he offers the living water again. He doesn't call it living water specifically here, but we know he's referring to that. And even here, right, it's a water springing up to eternal life. So again, he's obviously talking about something spiritual significant. Anything else or any questions that you might have from this part? I had a big question from verse 16 when I was
Verse
going through the
16.
story.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead. You got one?
Why did Jesus suggest to call her husband and come back?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a kind of an odd question, right? When she says, "Sir, give me this water," and then he says, "Go get your husband." It's like, well, wait a minute, what does that have to do with the situation here? So, okay, good. Those are good. Anybody else have one from this section? All right, Jason, thanks. That was great. All right, 17 to 22.
All right, that's my answer.
All right, Sonny, what
I
are
have
some things you notice here?
three highlighted here. In verse 19, the woman said to him, I perceive that you are a prophet. My question is, um, was in the light of Jesus, you know, knowing all the husbands of of the woman, Samaritan woman,
Yeah,
um, what is in the mind? How does the Samaritan people understood the word the prophet in the time? Was he talking about the Old Testament prophet and why he uses a prophet, or maybe I would assume, or he was referring to a kind of a prophet who was a capable of you know um 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 guessing of the situations. I don't know. I have the questions of that uh
yeah, yeah.
word. I
What
perceive
was in
that
her
you are a
mind?
prophet.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So just thinking if the Samaritan woman refers to the Old Testament prophet, or does they have if they have access to the letter prophet, like you know. Anyway, that's my question.
okay, good.
Yeah. And the second one is in verse 21 when Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, an hour is coming. So the word an hour is coming is kind of a recurring word that is common in John, especially in chapter 2 when when Jesus talked to her mother, woman, my hour is not yet come. Why you involve me this? So yeah, I have those questions. What could be the significance of that? An hour is coming here. Um, in the entire book and specific and especially here in verse 21 in chapter 4.
Good. That's a great observation, like noticing something that you've seen in other parts of the book.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, and lastly is when Jesus in verse 22, when Jesus says, you worship what you do not know, and we worship what we don't we know, for salvation comes to the. Why does Jesus says we worship, you worship what you do not know? What is the Samaritan uh what are the things that Samaritan does not know? So I just wanna figure that out. Are they have a full access of the entire Old Testament or just part of it? So yeah, I have some questions. Why Jesus said to the woman, "You worship what you do not know, and we worship what we know," and why salvation is from the Jew, not from the Samaritan? That's only my questions of here in.
Good. Yeah, there's some significant questions to consider here. One thing I noticed just as well is how the woman seems to change the subject here, right? Right after Jesus tells her, you have five husbands and the one you're living with, not yours. Then she says, I perceive you're a prophet. And then she asks about the place of worship. So that stuck out to me just as a woman changes the subject there. And then maybe even a question as to, as to why does she do this? Was she embarrassed? Um, did she now like, was it a real a question on her mind? Now that she realizes he's a prophet, maybe he can answer. So these are just some thoughts I had myself. All right, good, Sonny. Anyone else have one burning observation they want to include here?
Verse 20, Pastor Tim, our fathers worship in this mountain. What mountain?
Okay, yeah, worshipped
This
in this mountain. All right. So which mountain is she referring to? That's a good question. Now, some of us, as we do make these observations, these are our personal observations. So it's not like we're looking for answers to things here. We're not interpreting at this stage. We're just noticing things. And so each of us may notice something different, and each of us may have different questions. And there's no really, right or wrong question or observation here. It's just some things that stick out. So we're not here summarizing or, looking for interpreting this text yet. We're just trying to get to know it. And so these observations and the questions you guys have are excellent. This is the exact kind of thing we want to do as we go through and make observations. All right. So good job so far. Let's keep working our way through. Let's go to the next paragraph here. Verses 23 to 26. Okay, Lyndon, you'll probably have to speak up a little more. Hard to hear you.
Yeah, I'm looking at people here, but somehow doesn't help my voice. Just here already.
Okay, we'll try that. Still can't hear you real well, but what observations do you have?
Yeah. Verse 23, the word hour, that the hour is coming. What hour means in what hour is referring to? But
Yeah,
how? It's now
and
here.
even connects back to he said this in verse 21, and then even let's see, where was it Sonny that noticed? Yeah, Sonny noticed that an hour is coming, and then here he says it again. Good. Okay. What else do you see, Lyndon?
Qualification of what those two words first, because this way they work the Father is Spirit. What qualified is to work first. But what is Father and Spirit, the result of that, so who is to work first, the work of the Father and Spirit.
In verse 23.
So first time verse, and then verse 25.
Verse
Somehow
25.
The woman said to him, I know that Messiah coming. So somehow this woman has some information about this Messiah.
Yes.
He's coming. He said it was Christ. So my question is, where did how come woman have some sort of information about Messiah?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Somehow he has some information that makes the communication more interesting. Something and that the person that is talking to this time somehow for her that having 100% of what she knows, but somehow she has some about the Messiah. So yeah, my question of where and how that is come from.
Yeah, the Samaritans seem to have some insight into Messiah. We're going to see comments from the Samaritan people a little bit later too, that they have insights into that. So just some questions of what they understand about the Messiah. How did they come to know about him? It's pretty interesting. So good. Those are good questions. Okay, just for the sake of time, let's get to the next one here. And I don't remember who had this.
This mine, Pastor. Bien.
Oh, Ben, thank you. I forgot who. So okay, so what do you see here? What sticks out to you?
Um, in verse 27, I asked this question: why Jesus' disciples were marveling that Jesus was speaking with the woman? And another question is that is it prohibited in the Hebrew culture?
Yeah, it says here they were amazed, right?
Yeah.
And was this not permissible in their culture? Seems to be, right, because a comment was made earlier about the Jews and Samaritans have no dealings with one another. So that's likely why they were amazed, surprised. Anything else that sticks out to you?
In verse 32, Pastor Tim, what Jesus mean when he said, I have food to eat that you do not know about?
Yeah, again, he um, seems to be speaking about spiritual things, right? Um, but yeah, what does he mean specifically by that? So it's a good question. All right, good. Yeah, maybe one more just observation, something you notice.
I think that's what I see, Pastor.
Okay, no problem. One thing stuck out to me. It says the woman left her water pot. I just remember why does John mention that? So is that significant? May not be. It may be. It may not be. But just again, this is just things that we might notice or stick out to us. And as Lyndon was talking about previously, notice when she goes to the city, she says, "Is this not the Christ?" So again, they indicating the Samaritans had some. Um, the Samaritans had some knowledge of the Messiah, right? For her to just even ask them that. So that'd be something that stuck out to me. Okay, great. I think Yancey was these verses here, 33 to 38.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. This is in continuation with Ben. Um, when the disciples asked him to eat, so why did Jesus answered them with a figure of speech when he said, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work."
Yeah. So he's kind of answering his question above or statement above, right? I have food to eat you don't know about. And then he says, my food is to do the will of him who sent me. So obviously he's speaking figuratively. Um, so what was meant by that statement? Good. Anything
Yeah.
else?
And second one is in verse 36 when he said that already the one who reaps is receiving wages and gathering fruit for eternal life. And my question is, who are these people that already receiving their wages?
Okay, good. All
Yeah,
right,
and
maybe one more.
the last one is um, in farming. There is a general principle: the one who sows and the sowing and reaping principle. But here he says one sows and another reaps. So what does it mean?
Right. So normally we have a person reaps what they sow, but here he says one sows and another reaps. Right. So what's the meaning of that? Okay, good. And there's that's repeated. Notice he mentions it sows and reaps twice. And then even gathering fruit, right? That's a reaping activity. Harvest. So I noticed all of those things going together. In these verses. And even I think going back to, food, right? In verse 32. And then again, food in verse 34. So that was something that stuck out to me. All right, good. Last one. Last paragraph that we read here.
Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Uh, in verse 35, like, does it, like, my observation is this. Um, is Jesus speaking about the literal harvest, or is it in a spiritual tone? Something like that.
Okay, is this a literal harvest? Or is he still is he speaking figuratively here?
Yes.
Okay, good. Good question. All right, good. All right, let's get to the last paragraph here, because I want to make sure to get through the setting analysis as well. So who had it? Lito, did you have this one?
Yes, Pastor Tim.
Okay, you got a couple
39,
observations for us?
verse 39, woman's testimony. The woman's testimony.
Yes.
The woman's testimony, because many believe in him when he testifies about Jesus. Then in verse 40, observe this, many had asked Jesus to stay with him. The Samaritans asked Jesus to stay with him, even though they know that Jesus is not a Samaritan, he's a Jew.
Yeah.
Then in verse 41, we will see that when they hear the word of Jesus, they believe. Verse 41, many believe when they hear the word of Jesus. And then in verse 42, we see there the Savior of the world. Savior of the world.
Yeah, that's a significant statement, isn't it?
That's all, Pastor Tim.
All right, good. Those are good. One thing I noticed as well, notice the word believed repeated here.
Believe.
Okay, which connects in right with maybe remember the purpose of the book as a whole was on belief, that you would believe Jesus is the Christ and have life in his name. So we see that theme here. All right, good. It's a great example, guys, of exactly what the intent of this part of the setting analysis is, to read and make observations. So it's these kinds of things, questions that we have, just things that we notice. All right. So usually I would spend probably half an hour, 30 minutes or so reading through the story several times and then making these observations. Again, with the goal of these help us get more familiar with the story. And once you've done that, then the next step in the setting analysis is to identify the physical aspects of the story. And so here, let's see. Okay, so I'm gonna see if we can figure this out here. Okay. So for this this step, we just want to identify, okay, physical aspects, remember, that's the where. So as we consider this particular story here, and I can't quite fit it all in, but honestly, the where is really found in the first few verses there. So I'll just highlight those for us. See if I can make it a little bigger. Okay. So maybe does anybody see anything here that gives us indication as to where? Physical aspects. Anybody? Do we have a location mentioned?
Samaria.
Yeah, right. Verse 4 and then in verse 5, right? So Jesus came to Samaria, and we actually even have a more specific, right? I'll put here verse 5 because that's where Samaria to Sychar, right? To the ground Jacob gave Joseph. And then verse 6, specifically, he was at Jacob's well. Yeah, that's a very specific location. And then if we do some study, if we look in Genesis, we can find actually Genesis 33:19 indicates that this was near Shechem, the ground that Jacob purchased near Shechem, which we also learn the nearby mountain was Mount Gerizim. So we'd have to, if we did some cross references, try to identify this particular location mentioned here, we could learn that information about it. All right. And then we learn he was at Jacob's well, which we learn in verse 12 later, which was dug by Jacob himself. Verse 12 tells us, right? You're not greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well. So, okay. And then if you want to note the physical aspects, the water pots mentioned, but, that's not very specific. I think this, though, is very specific place that is provided here for the where of the story. Key is they're in Samaria and at Jacob's well. So that tells us very specifically where they're located. Okay. Any questions or other input on that as far as the physical aspects, the where? If you want to mention that he traveled from Judea, he left Judea, you could do that. You could mention that. But actually where the story is located, the events of the story, that's what we're interested in, particularly that the setting is the physical location. Where do the events of this story take place? So that's what we're trying to get to. And so, as I said, John here tells us very, very specifically where it is. So, okay. The next would be, there's no questions. The next thing we want to look for then is the when of the story. That is the temporal aspects. When does this story take place? Okay, and partly we would go back, because if we look at John, the first 3 chapters, right, the story begins sometime after, perhaps even right after Jesus's time in the wilderness, right? Chapter 1 opens with that. Then he goes up to, so he spends some time there. Then he goes up to Galilee. Then he has come back to Judea, and now he's leaving Judea. So John 4, as we study this Gospel of John and the other Gospels, it seems that his ministry in Judea, was like in the first year or so of his ministry. This is probably likely early in Jesus's ministry, perhaps within the first year. Don't know for sure, but if we try to put together and piece together the events from the Gospels, the timeline, it seems like this might fit in with the early part of his ministry. But notice we do have a specific time of day mentioned here in the story. Did anybody see that? I guess before you answer that, maybe we can remember. We remember, sorry, pull this up. Right, John chapter 1, right, was when Jesus just came out of the wilderness. And then the events in chapter 2 was on the third day. He was up in Galilee, right? And on the third day, meaning 3 days after the events that happened in the Jordan River, after coming out of the wilderness, 3 days later, he was up in Cana of Galilee. And then he went to Capernaum, which is in Galilee, and stayed there. And then the Passover came a little later. And so Jesus went to Jerusalem. Okay, so he's in Galilee. He's in Jordan, beyond the Bethany in the first chapter. Then he's up in Cana a few days later, second chapter. He stays there for a period of time until Passover comes. And then he goes back down to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. And that's where he meets Nicodemus, right? And that's where then Jesus says he stayed in the land of Judea, was spending time there. Jesus is baptizing. Okay. And then we come to chapter 4, when he now leaves leaves Jerusalem area where they were baptizing to go back up into Galilee. All right. So he's kind of going back and forth here a little bit. All right. But then notice we have here in this first few verses, you come back to this one. Does anyone see here? There's a specific time of day mentioned.
Sixth hour, about 6th hour in chapter 4, verse 6. So that about 12 p.m.
Yeah, Jesus was at the well about the 6th hour. And depending on if you're looking at it from Roman or a Jewish time, I think that probably John typically went by the Roman time. So this would have been about noon, 12 p.m. Okay, the first hour was 6 a.m. or around sunrise. All right, so again, interesting. John is very specific here. He's very specific about the place, and he's specific about the time of day. So those would be things to keep in mind as we think about this. There's also one other possible time element or clue later in the story. Let me pull this back up. And it actually has to do with someone had the question about whether or not Jesus was being figurative or literal when he was talking about the harvest. If he was being literal, let me see if I can find it. Yeah, it was here, verse 35. Okay. Verse 35, if literal, then we actually have a time period. If he literally meant that the harvest was 4 months away, then this account was likely in the springtime, April or May, because that's typically when they planted, and they harvest normally around September in the fall. So that would mean if Jesus did mean this literally, then that would give us a clue as to the time period here was in April or May. And as we study the story more, I think he did mean this literally. But we wouldn't know that for sure yet. It's a question we'd have, but that's why I put if this is literal, then that tells us these events took place in the springtime, not long after they planted. Okay, so that's all we're looking for as we consider the temporal aspects, the time aspects. Just do what details do we have about the time of the events in the story, and that can be significant. You know, even if it seems like a small detail, can be very important to the story. Sometimes not, but sometimes it is. So we just want to take note of that. When does this story take place? So we have a general idea, probably earlier on, at least in the first half of Jesus's ministry. And then we have a specific detail as far as the exact time of day. And then possibly we also have a general idea of what time of year this took place in as well. All right. Anybody have questions about that? Does that make sense? So notice too, by the way, we're not consulting any commentaries here or Bible study references, or it's in the story. We can just, if we carefully read through the story, that's how we're extracting the information. And cross-reference can be helpful, like I did where, you know, when I looked up, you know, Jacob's land or Jacob's well. Do we know anywhere that that's mentioned? That's where I had the Genesis 33 passage. So you can look at other passages of scripture. Also looking at the other gospels and the sequence of events, you know, that's fine as well. But my point is, you don't have to look at resources to get this information. You can, that's okay to do, but the more we can do on our own, the better. All right. Okay, a big one here when we consider the next thing as far as the setting. Remember, I said we want to consider the who. That is, what do we know about the culture? Right, the cultural aspects of the story. And here we have a significant cultural aspect, right? He is in a Samaria, in the town of Samaritans, or right nearby the town of Samaritans. He's speaking with a Samaritan woman, and then later he will visit the town and stay with them for a couple of days. And so we would notice here, verse 9, as someone observed previously, John mentions Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. There's a significant cultural issue here regarding relationship between Jew and Samaritan, right? Even later, as the disciples, they were amazed he was speaking with a woman. Okay, so there's some one cultural aspect that we would need to know about. And we learned this in other passages too, right? The parable of the Good Samaritan, and even a couple other references in the New Testament to Samaritans that they, what is it, Matthew 10, I think mentions. Matthew 10, 14, I think it is. It mentions this practice of shaking the dust off of your feet. And I think Acts, shaking the dust off their feet. Actually, that was a cultural practice that was carried out when the Jews would walk through Samaria. That they would, once they left Samaritan soil, they would shake the dust off of their feet because they didn't want the Samaritan soil to be on their shoes. So it was, but we we can kind of go back, and this would take a little time to do this, but you can go back and actually identify the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans by understanding the history between those two cultures. So we want to know, well, who are the Samaritans? And why would this woman say that Jews have no or John, sorry, why would John say Jews have no dealings with Samaritans? So this would require a little bit of effort to understand the Samaritans and the relationship between Jew and Samaritan. But we go back to 2 Kings 17 first. If you remember, the Assyrians had taken the 10 northern tribes into captivity, right? And then what the Assyrians did is they spread the Jews all over the Assyrian Empire, and they brought other people, Gentiles, that from other nations that they had captured, and they brought some of them and put them in Israel. This was the Assyrians' way of controlling their empire. Because then if you scattered your nation, your people around, they couldn't gather together and fight against Assyria, because now they live in different places with other cultures. And so what happened is the northern tribes, that northern part of Israel, now would integrate it with Jew and Gentile, with pagans that had come in. And so they were now no longer purely Jewish there. It was a mixed race. And if we go to Ezra 4 and Nehemiah 2, there are these people that are opposed to the Jews when they were trying to rebuild the temple. If you remember that account in Ezra, that they were, God allowed, Cyrus sent them back to rebuild the temple. But then the people of the land, they were called, the ones beyond the river, Euphrates, these are the Samaritans, people that lived in that region. And they tried to stop and hinder the work of the Jews to rebuild the temple. And then it happened again when the Jews came back in Nehemiah to rebuild the wall. People of the land, the Samaritans, tried to stop them from doing that. So there was this, hostility, tension between the Jews and the Samaritans that started, back, the roots of it were in 2 Kings 17, which is around 720 BC. And then from there, as each generation of these Gentile, Jewish, mixed race people, there just became hostility, so that in around 500 BC, there was, they were really enemies. And then we do learn from extra biblical sources in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, those are in the Apocrypha, probably a reasonable historical accuracy. Most of the apocryphal books aren't accurate, but I think the Maccabees it's not inerrant, it's not inspired, but there does seem to be a reasonable, it's reasonable to assume, probably fairly reliable depiction of events. And there describes that, again, the tension and the hostility between Jews and Samaritans. And in fact, the Jews tore down the temple the Samaritans had built on Mount Gerizim. We learn about that. It happened around 125 BC. Now, that's not in the Bible. That's in the extra biblical source. But if you did some extra study, you could find that out. All this to say that there was great tension between Jew and Samaritan. And we even see a few references in the other Gospels as to that relationship between Jew and Samaritan, and even how women were treated in that culture. So these would be some details you would want to include, because we want to know, okay, what do we know about the culture? And this is actually very significant to this story. And we'll see that more as we consider the plot of the story, that this tension between Samaritan and Jew was very, very significant to what was going on in the story. And even if you remember the parable of the Good Samaritan, how Jesus used that understanding of the culture and that the relationship between Samaritan and Jew, and he used the Samaritan to be the good guy in that particular parable, because those around him were the Jewish leaders who hated the Samaritans. And Jesus was giving that parable in response to their question about who is my neighbor, right? So those would be things you would want to point out here, because that's part of the setting here, the background to the story. That's an important thing to know about the culture that will really give more insight into what's going on in this story. Okay? Questions on that? Comments on that? Cries of agony, despair? Some of you are awake. All right, so hopefully that gives you an idea, again, of what we're looking for when we're doing the setting analysis. Let me just quickly do the last part of this, and then we'll be done for this morning. And unless I don't want to rush things. If there is a question or a comment, I do want to give you opportunity for that. One thing that also, while I'm thinking about it, maybe a question comes up. Okay, so I'm looking at this, studying the culture, the background. How much of this cultural things, the setting, do I bring into the message when I'm teaching this passage? Do I want to get into all these details and spend all this time going through the Jewish and Samaritan problem? And well, really, my perspective on this is give just enough information so that they have a feel for the cultural issues, but only cover those things that are going to be significant to the story. So we need to study the whole story first. We need to figure out what is the point of the story. And then from that, we'll be able to determine what cultural, what parts of the setting are important enough to bring into the sermon. What do they need to know about the setting that will help in telling the story and help them understand the story? Okay. So we're not going to spend the whole, half the sermon talking about Jews and Samaritans. Okay. But we will need to tell them something so they have an idea of that tension that existed between those two people groups. All right. And it can be as simple as that, depending on time. You could say it is historically, these two, the Samaritans and Jews, did not get along. They have a history of tension between one another. And you can leave it at that. Or if you want to maybe bring in a couple of other details, that would be fine. But we just want to be careful we don't give a whole historical lesson here, and we don't get into the details of the story. So basically, it's tell just enough that was significant to the story that will help your hearers better understand the story. Okay? All right. One last part of the setting analysis to consider. And that is, it's just kind of the general, any other aspects of the story. And sometimes here I might just put in kind of how the setting of this story is connected to the stories around it. So it takes place between the first and second signs. In fact, I put together here notice, really, this is the one section of the book. I talked last week about the larger sections of the Gospel of John, and it begins with the beginning of Jesus's ministry. Then we have the wedding of Cana, and that is where Jesus performed his first sign, as John tells us there. And then we have 4 stories, I guess technically 5 stories that are given. And then notice, let me just show this to you again. I think I showed this last week, but if you get to John, the end of chapter 4, he heals, he goes back to Cana, by the way, right? So John 2, if you remember, John 2, he goes up, there's the wedding in Cana, and then he says in verse 11, this was the beginning of his signs. Okay, then we have the cleansing of the temple, Jesus' talk with Nicodemus, John's testimony about Jesus. Then we have the woman at the well, and then we have another healing in Cana at the end of chapter 4. Right after the woman at the well, Jesus goes to Galilee, right? After 2 days, he went from there into Galilee. So he went from Samaria into Galilee. And then when he came there, the Galileans received him. He came to Cana. He heals the royal official's son there. And then notice the end of chapter 4. This is a second sign Jesus did when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. Why does that matter? What's the significance? Well, I think by doing that, here we kind of see this section in the Gospel of John really covers John mentions it as the first and second sign. All right, so that's bracketing this section, because in chapter 5, John moves in toward examples of unbelief. And there's a shift in his gospel. He focuses on chapter 5 and following on Jesus's enemies. But in these first 4 chapters, particularly from 2 to 4, we have this first sign and second sign. And then in between it, we have these 5 stories. One of them being Nicodemus, an extended conversation Jesus has with Nicodemus about the gospel, and then an extended conversation with the woman at the well. Again, a gospel-focused interaction that he has with her. All right, and so this story that we're looking at in John 4 is kind of within this group of stories, and interestingly, it just comes not long after the story with Nicodemus. All right, and that we'll look at that a little bit later, but that's just something we want to consider here. It's helpful to kind of see, okay, where is this story that I'm studying? Where is it located within the broader narrative? And just make a couple of notes of that here. So that's what this particular step is doing. Okay. All right. Well, that's the setting analysis. That's the example from John 4 for the setting analysis. Anybody have any thoughts or questions about that, or about your passage, or anything else? I'm getting back to grading. I've been able to grade the first couple assignments, so I'm going to keep working at that. For me to try to get caught up. But you guys have any questions on anything before we end this session? All right. Well, hopefully this helped you a little bit. Next week, Lord willing, plan on meeting again. We'll keep going through John 4. We'll focus our attention next week on the scene analysis. So that's when we'll really start getting into the story. But this first step of the setting is just meant to give us sort of the overview, big picture, get us into the story. And now the next week, we're really going to start breaking it down, doing the scene analysis example. So I hope you guys will be able to make that. And again, as well, use these times also if you do have specific questions about your passage or anything else. Happy to answer those. I'm going to ask Chrysler if you could close